If I may have your attention, we will get underway. My name's George Beck, and I am Chair of Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections, also known as Clean Elections because it's easier to say. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and our goal is to preserve the will of the people over the power of money. Please sign in at the registration desk if you haven't done so. Take one of our brochures. It has our website address, and we're also on Facebook, at least for now. And they show what we've accomplished as well as the slides that have been playing here tonight. We'd love to have you on our mailing list. That's free. And if you wanted to be a member, it's one of the best deals in town. It's only $25 a year. We are co-sponsors of a rally at the state capitol on the first day of the session, Feb 11 at 3 p.m. All of the democracy groups are going to gather and show the legislators and the public that there is a demand for reform in Minnesota on campaign finances. I wanted to note that we have a state representative here tonight, Representative Ginny Claiborne. Thank you very much for attending. We are very pleased to have our state demographer, Susan Brower, as our speaker this evening. She'll speak about the implications of the 2020 census for Minnesota. She's been state demographer for 8 years now, and she has traveled the state talking with Minnesotans about the new social and economic realities accompanying population changes. As well as gathering its own demographic data, her office is working with the U.S. Census to ensure the fullest and most accurate count of population in 2020, which of course will be used in legislative and congressional redistricting in 2021. And I understand it's somehow related to federal funding also, so it's very important. Prior to joining the demographer's office, Ms. Brower was a population researcher for the Wilder Foundation in St. Paul and at the University of Michigan's Population Studies Center. She earned a PhD at the University of Michigan and a master's degree at a little better institution, the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School for Public Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Brower.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. What my formal bio does not say, which I should add, because I seem to always tack it on at the end, is I was born and raised here in Minnesota. I grew up in South Minneapolis, where I live today with my husband and 2 snarky teenagers. I'm crazy about them, but indeed they are snarky. And so I really do care about this state and the work that we're doing for the census and the work that I do generally. It is personal to me in addition to my job. I'm going to tell you about how the state is growing and how that is going to likely impact congressional apportionment and redistricting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the census and what we can expect this time around. And then I've saved plenty of time for questions and discussion as well. So let's get to it. Minnesota really does pretty well in terms of growth. If you look at kind of our neighborhood in the U.S., oh, look at that. I have some stray text on there. Just look away from that. Look away. What you should see from this graph here is that Minnesota has grown about 6% since the 2010 census, and that's just about the same as the U.S. overall. The states in the Midwest and in the Northeast of the U.S. are growing much more slowly than Minnesota is, but if you compare us to the states in the South and in the western part, they're growing much more rapidly. So our overall picture is we're doing okay for where we are in the U.S. We're just not growing as fast as many of the southern states and western states. So we've added 335,000 additional people since the last census. And I'll talk a little bit about where that growth has happened. But first, just to give you a sense of the scale of our growth relative to other places and what's been happening elsewhere around the US, you can see there's our 336 that we added. The very darkest green states on this map are showing you more growth. Texas added 3.8 million in the time that we added our 336,000. So you have a sense of just how different we're talking about when we're talking about growth. Florida, 2.7 million, just over 2 million for California. A lot of growth going on in those three states. If you look at Illinois, on the other hand, they've lost 159,000 people since the last census. So there's really a lot of different scenarios going on, and Minnesota is holding its own. But what we expect after this next census, after 2020, of course, is the congressional redistricts will be reapportioned based on the growth that's happened since 2010. And will reflect this growth that you see here on this map, shifting kind of more seats to those states that have been growing like crazy, and away from states typically in the Midwest and the Northeast where we're seeing much less growth. We were doing pretty well in terms of growth this decade. I was really feeling buoyed and hopeful that we were getting really close to that line of keeping that congressional seat. And I'll tell you, I do think we still have a shot. But this very last year of growth, it came in just in December, this estimate, and it wasn't as high as I would have liked to have seen it. We're still plugging along, but it's going to be close if we're able to keep that 8th congressional district. It is going to be very close. We had some really strong years of growth in 2016 through 2018, and now it's tapered a little bit. And so, you know, it is what it is. Part of what's happening is that we've seen less immigration and migration from other states in 2019. The blue bars on this graph are showing you the number of people that the state gains because of international immigration each year. And that kind of declined during the recession, and after the recession it picked up again, so we got more international immigration. What we have seen since 2016, 2017 or so is we've seen less international immigration in Minnesota. And you can see that reflecting in those numbers as we see fewer and fewer international immigrants coming to the state. That's not unique to Minnesota. That's an international issue. In part, it has to do with caps on the refugee population. It's federal policy. It's either caps on the refugee populations, which is part of what's reducing the growth there, but it's also a slowing of the processing of visas of all types. So we're seeing the slower processing of visas for college professors that are coming to teach in our universities, for students who are coming to universities to learn, for people who are coming, say, to the Mayo Clinic on H-1B visas. Those are high-skilled visas. We're seeing a slowing of that processing, and that has led to an overall reduction in the number of people who come to Minnesota, and that reduces our growth. Again, that's happening nationwide. That's not just here in Minnesota, but that's part of the change that we're seeing in the recent period. The other thing that's going on, the green bars here, are showing you how many people we have gained or lost to other states. So people moving around the U.S. And what we had in Minnesota was for a very long time, over a decade, we lost year over year over year more people than we gained from other states. When you think about who's moving around, think about young people, because those are the people who are driving that trend. People who are going to college, people who are going off for their first internship, you know, for their first job. They're falling in love, they're following people across the country. That's who is driving this trend largely. What we saw in 2017 and 2018 was a turnaround in that trend, and everyone cheered, yay, we've got people coming, we need people here. This is a good thing, particularly for employers who have had a really hard time filling jobs as the economy has done so well, as employment has been so low. They really like to see those numbers grow because it means potentially more workers. So we saw that for 2 years, and now what we have seen this last 2019 is almost just no net gain from domestic migration. So pulling that together, that explains part of why our growth numbers are down. We also are seeing fewer births. That's part of a longer term trend where you just have smaller family sizes. And that's kind of part of what many parts of the US are experiencing as well. So we roll all that together, the growth that's happening around. Did you have a question?
Very quickly.
Yeah.
For the green, do we have a sense of where in the state that population migration went away from? Was it the cities or greater Minnesota?
So it's both. The bulk of it is to the 7-county metropolitan area, just because it's kind of a bigger pull. But it's kind of spread around. And some of it, I should say, isn't kind of a first-time arrival in the states. These are annual numbers, so it also includes people who go away and come back later in their lives, or when they have families, or are returning after school. All those numbers are wrapped into these annual numbers. Yeah.
How much of that net out-migration is retired, older retired people leaving for the South?
It's not as much as you would think. I don't have that graphic right in front of me, but I'm happy to share it with you. The lion's share of all migration is young people, 18, 19, 20 years old. It's a very small share that are people in their 60s, 70s. But when you look at that group is going to Arizona, California, and Florida, primary three states. Yeah. But most of what's driving this is the younger generation. Yeah. So we've got kind of this growth that's doing A-okay for where we are in the state, but just not quite what we had hoped, to be sure that we are going to keep that 8th congressional district. This is what apportionment looked like after the last census, after 2010. The gray states on here kept the same number of seats. The blue states gained, and the states kind of in that orange rust color declined, lost a seat. So what do you see in terms of the pattern on the map? Texas and Florida, they were growing in the 2000s as well. And the states that lose tend to be in the Midwest, tend to be in the Northeast. That's matching that pattern of growth. So we expect to see some of these continuations of this trend this time around after this census. Louisiana kind of stands out there because of the hurricane that happened just before 2010, and so there were some displacement that could have led to this. So they kind of stand out in terms of the geography here, but that's kind of a different special circumstance. So in 2010, we kept that 8th congressional seat. We were thinking we were going to lose it then. And it was only by 8,000, just over 8,000 people. It was a razor-thin margin. Minnesota received the very last seat that Congress had to give, the 435th seat. And so we are right back in that same position again in 2020. I showed you kind of that growth was pretty strong for us in the latter part of this decade, up until the last data point in 2019. When folks have kind of run some different scenarios, they have us losing the seat just barely, between almost 7,000 people and 22,000. So it keeps us not quite keeping that 8th congressional district based on kind of the growth patterns that they've seen over the last few years. Yeah?
And what data do you make the estimates? How do you come up with
Oh, yeah, thank you. So these data are based off of some population estimates that the Census Bureau puts together. Our office also puts together population estimates, and we provide feedback for theirs. But they're basing it first off the decennial census in 2010, and then they add births and subtract deaths. So they're using administrative records to account for births, deaths, and migration between states. So it's something that I want to point out about that is these are just estimates, and as we get further and further away from the census, they get poorer and poorer in quality because there's more error that gets built into these estimates. First I want to tell you one thing about kind of these estimates, how they work. On the left-hand side is a set of estimates that says, okay, if all the states in the U.S. continue to grow at the same rate that they grew for the first 9 years, this is what apportionment would look like. So you're assuming a growth rate for all 50 states and carrying it forward to the next year. That's where we have a loss of about just by 6,700. If we look at just 2018 and 2019, the growth rates for all 50 states there and carry those forward into the next year, then we lose that seat by about 22,000 people. So either way, we are on the losing. When these estimates were made last year, after the 2018 estimates came out, it had us just barely keeping it in one of their estimates. So that's changed just because that growth has dropped off in 2019. But I do want to stress that 7,000 to 22,000 is a very small number. And there is a lot of error that is built into these estimates. After the last census, the 2009 number was adjusted upward by 15,000. And so it just gives you a sense that they're not census counts. These are estimates based on a number of different records. So there is some reason to feel hopeful that this is not written in stone and that we can certainly hold on to this 8th seat. And I think Minnesota really is in a good position in terms of response rate. We have all kinds of folks who have been working on census engagement and outreach for the last 2 years. And so we really have people who are ready to go and ready to kind of promote this count, because the apportionment will happen based on the number of people we count, not kind of the number of people we have, which has us potentially at an advantage relative to other states that haven't put as much effort into it and who maybe aren't historically as good as Minnesotans are at being counted. So last census, we came second only to Wisconsin in response rates. We were the second state in terms of response. We were up there in 2000 as well. We do okay. People kind of get their form in their mail. Minnesotans tend to get their form in their mail and say, oh, the census, okay, I'll fill it out. That's not the same everywhere. Of course, it's not the same across the whole state, but by and large, Minnesota is a state that's civically engaged, that is willing to provide this information. Finally, I just wanted to point out that when we project numbers, we're assuming growth rates for all the states. And if one state grows much faster or much slower than anticipated, that can kind of throw off the whole priority value, the priorities of who gets what seat next. And so I say that all to say that for me, it's not looking great. Like, I don't think it's a shoo-in that we're keeping this seat, but it's certainly within striking distance. 7 to 22,000 is not out of reach at all. That's a small number that could easily be made up either by kind of the fuzziness in the estimates or by a really excellent census count. And so that's something that really motivates a lot of folks. If we were to lose a congressional district, our districts would need to grow by about 100,000 people, because we're splitting the state up into 7 pieces, equal pieces, rather than 8. And so that grows our districts by about 100,000 people. Do you guys have, I should have had this in front of you, but do you have a map in your head of what the congressional districts kind of look like? No? Let me dance it out for you. No, I'm not going to do that. What I will tell you are the greater Minnesota districts are enormous. They stretch, the first district stretches really across the whole southern part of the state, entirely, the whole southern part of the state. the district on the western edge also, almost across that whole state. If they need to add 100,000 more people to a district that's already huge, they understand the importance of what a change like that means. And so that resonates with a lot of folks in greater Minnesota, just to know just how much more area they would need to cover to make up for that 100,000 more people. Because they're not all living in towns all closely concentrated. You know, they're spread out across the area. It's really going to make a big difference for a lot of folks in greater Minnesota in particular. And that brings me to kind of where the growth is within the state. And what we have seen in recent years is this really high concentration of growth in the Twin Cities, and particularly, even more than that, in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the blue areas on this map are showing you the counties that have grown since the last census, and the orange areas are showing you counties that have lost population. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the losses haven't been great. They're not huge. Together, all those counties together that have lost population have only jointly, all summed up, have only jointly lost 16,000 people. So you contrast that to the gains in Hennepin County alone has added 109,000 people in the first 8 years. This is just in the first 8 years of this decade. So the growth is really very, very concentrated in the Twin Cities metro, and even more so in Hennepin and Ramsey County, and even more so than that in the center cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. There are many other suburban cities that make the list of top growing cities. You can see many of the suburbs within the Twin Cities metropolitan on this list. You can see many of our metropolitan cities, greater Minnesota cities like Rochester on the list. Mankato's on the list, I believe. This is just happens to be our top 15 or 20 fastest growing cities. What I want to draw your attention to is just how much growth happened in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the first 8 years of this decade. So Minneapolis has added 45,000 additional folks in just 8 years, and St. Paul has added close to 30,000. Now, around 2010, when the census was taken last, Minneapolis worked really, really hard on its census count. It had people out there in the neighborhoods and working with folks who are likely to be missed, and it won an award even for all the work that it did to ensure that people were counted. And what happened was when the census count came out, they rushed to let's assume like the whole city of Minneapolis rushed to their mailbox to get their number. But of course that didn't happen, but I just think it's more dramatic. They tore open their envelope to see what that Minneapolis number would be, and they had lost 40 people between 2000 and 2010. So no growth. St. Paul had lost even more. No growth during 2000 to 2010. Now look at just in the first 8 years, and you see 45,000, almost 46,000 in the first 8 years in Minneapolis, 28,000 in St. Paul. It gives you a sense of just how big this turnaround is, and also gives you a sense for some of the redistricting at the state legislative level that will need to happen after this 2020 census to accommodate some of that growth. So we've looked at some of the estimates of our cities around Minnesota and kind of looked at the districts that need to expand or to contract based on the new population numbers. And what I will tell you generally is the center cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul have seen tremendous amount of growth. Those areas will need to contract to keep the same number of people that some of the larger greater Minnesota districts have. And you can see kind of on the left column those districts that will need to expand because they have either lost population or they have not kept up the same level of growth that other districts around the state have experienced. Generally, what's going to happen after this next redistricting is a shift toward where these high growth areas are. And in this decade, those high growth areas have really been in the Twin Cities metro, plus some of those larger greater Minnesota cities that we saw on the list, Rochester, for example, Mankato. That's all I can do in terms of predictions for you for redistricting and for apportionment. I want to talk a little bit about the census and then hopefully chat with you more about any questions you have or comments you have for me. The census happens April 1st every 10 years. It's going to be really tough to take this time. It's always tough to take a census, but it's going to be especially tough this time around. And that's because the context in which it is happening is pretty hard when you're trying to collect information from folks. So we've got people who are distrustful of government, particularly federal government. We have people who are fearful of government. We have people who are highly mobile, people living in complex, informal kind of living arrangements where it makes it a little bit harder to know just who should go on that form. We have declining response rates. Nobody's excited to fill out a survey because we get surveyed every time we turn around. This is just one more survey. And so it's really hard for folks to have a sense for that this is the biggest, the most important survey that you will take for some time. That's just the context in which the census will take place. I will say one of the things that I think increases our chances of having a good census. Most of these are kind of, I put on the negative side in terms of making it harder to have a good census. I think the fact that for the first time we'll be able to fill this out online gives a lot of folks options that we didn't have in the past. It means that you can bring the census form to the community. You don't have to tell them, hey, the census is important, please go home and dig through your junk mail and find that form and remember to do it and send it back. Go. You can have a laptop, you can have a tablet right where people are already gathering, such as an event like this, come mid-March, and people can choose to take the census right there. And so I think that opens up new possibilities for reaching groups that are historically undercounted. The census, of course, determines political representation. The concern is that, when people are missed, the districts won't have the appropriate number of people in them. They'll go off of whatever the count is, and that means that some of the districts that have groups that are more likely to be missed will not be appropriately reflecting those folks. They'll have to grow larger to encompass the same number of people who were counted. So we've talked a lot about kind of the redistricting process and how the census is used for that. I want to talk a little bit about what it means in terms of money. And the most recent estimate coming out of George Washington University is that Minnesota receives about $15 billion per year on the basis of the census. And this is an annual number, and that was a billion each year. It breaks down to about $2,800 per person, or $28,000 over the course of the decade per person. So it's a lot of money that's distributed on the basis of this count. It goes to programs like lunches in the schools, LIHEAP, that's energy assistance, which is really important here in Minnesota, Medicaid, some insurance programs, public insurance programs, special education. This is a very common way of distributing funds, is making sure that you're giving more money to more people. And so, when you aggregate this all up, you start getting a sense of just how much money rests on this one count. We've got this tiny little window ahead of us in the next few months to get this count right, to do what we can to make sure folks are counted here. And then whatever our count ends up being, we're kind of stuck with that count for the next 10 years. That's true in terms of funding, that's true in terms of representation, It's just this little short window. And so I'd like to encourage you all to kind of engage in telling folks that it's an important thing to do, and working with kind of your own organizations and your networks to make sure that people are ready for it when it comes. One of the things that's particularly hard this time around is finding people to be census takers. The last time we had a census, we were coming off of a recession. We had all kinds of people looking for work. We don't have that this time around. I know these numbers because the other part of my job in part is talking about labor force and the demand for labor force. I know that Minnesota right now has 147,000 job openings and has 100,000 people actively looking for work. So we've got this surplus of jobs right now, and the Census Bureau comes in and plunks down about 8,000 more jobs on top of that number. And so what we've got right now is not enough people to actually do the work of taking the census. So the work that people will be doing is following up with households that don't respond online or by mail. And I want to encourage you all, I know you're not looking for work, but I want to encourage you all to think about doing something like this, and to spread the word that this is something that is a good thing to do for your community. It also pays pretty well, particularly Hennepin County and Ramsey County. I'm passing these around, I don't care. This is how you apply. This really is one of the ways that I think we could have real trouble in Minnesota, is if we don't get enough people to do this work. And right now, in many parts of the state, we only have about 30% the number of applicants that was the goal at this point. So it's really, the numbers are bearing out that we're not getting a huge response. It's looking a little bit better in Hennepin County lately, but this is really something I'd encourage you to do and to pass on to anyone. The minimum number of hours that you can work per week and be a census worker is 5. So if you say, I only want to work 5 and I want to work them on Saturdays, that's something that they can accommodate. So,
What is the age?
18 and above. I have a 17-year-old that's just missed it. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, is there a role, I know, having just heard you say that the minimum hours can be as low as 5, is there a role for volunteers in the census?
I love it when people ask questions for which I have a prepared slide. So there's something, our website is right here, mn.gov 2020 census, and it talks about what's going on in Minnesota around the census and how you can get involved. One of the ways you can get involved is to connect with your local complete count committees. I don't know how many folks here are from St. Louis Park, but I know they have a very active committee. Minneapolis has a most suburbs around here do have complete count committees that are voluntary group of folks who are working on this promotion work. So I would encourage you to go to our website and go to the drop-down tab that says Find a CCC, and there's a map and contact information for how to get a hold of folks. The other thing you can do is to pledge to take the census right now. You can text COUNT to this number, and it will give you information that you can kind of spread the word to your networks via social media or by text or however it is you talk to people. You can tell them in person too, I guess, but this is the digital way to do it, I guess. There's a lot of activities that are going on, and I think there are a lot of ways that you can plug in with local efforts. Some folks are doing things like apartment building, canvassing. Some people are having events. Some people are hosting tables in schools, hosting tables in community centers. Again, the idea is to bring the census to places where that trust is already built and where it's a familiar and safe place to fill out that form. And that's all the information I prepped for you. I'm happy to take questions and comments. And what do you got?
You're talking about having tables at events. Would it
Yeah.
be appropriate, caucuses are coming up soon, to have census tables at caucuses?
Yeah. So is it appropriate at caucuses? And I'm going to have to say that I would be careful probably with that one. I would be careful just because we work pretty hard to make sure that people know that this is a nonpartisan activity. And so I guess while it's another place that people gather, another place where people feel connected. My guess is that the people who are attending caucuses already probably are likely to fill out their forms. But they might get missed. It might be young people who are moving around and just don't see it or something. Where we're really encouraging that work to happen is in places where we know people are likely to be missed. And that really can take a range of places, of settings. Yeah. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I'd be a little bit leery just because, I certainly wouldn't in my position, but you guys go where you live, go where you have networks. Yeah.
How is Minnesota counting college students and people incarcerated?
Yeah, so those are federal policies. The question was, how is Minnesota counting people in colleges and people who are incarcerated? So the census is administered by the Census Bureau, and so the rules for where to count college students and where to count people who are incarcerated are the same across the U.S. For college students, it's where they live and sleep most of the time. That's kind of the general rule for everyone. And then that means they give a little bit further guidance for college students. If they live on campus, they're counted in their dorms on campus, which I know is a little bit confusing for folks who are familiar with how college students vote. It's in the dorm where they're counted. If they're off campus, they're counted off campus, and if they're living with their parents and going to school, they're counted in the home with their parents. College students are a group that's among the most likely to be missed because they are so mobile. Because if you think about the college students in your lives and how many of them live particularly off campus, they might be living with, 5, 6 roommates. It might be kind of on a rolling basis as, semesters come and go, and someone goes and they're abroad and they come back and someone's just staying with us until their lease opens up. And, it's not a household where, someone knows I'm the person who's going to fill out this form for the 6 of us, right? So if you have college students or connections with them, that really is a group that we focus on that's likely to be missed. Incarcerated folks are counted in the prison, in the institution where they're incarcerated. And there has been some concern by a lot of people that doesn't make sense for some communities, particularly if it's a small community with a large prison population within its borders. But that was where the Census Bureau landed this time with the residency rules. It may change in 2030, but for 2020, it's the same as it was last time. Yeah.
What about snowbirds?
Oh, snowbirds. All snowbirds should be counted in Minnesota. No, mark my words. Okay. No, but for real, the Census Bureau doesn't care where they're counted. They just want to make sure they're counted. It's pretty tough for Minnesotans who are snowbirds. For communities that have a lot of snowbirds. And that is because, of course, in March and April, when the census happens, that's when the snowbirds have flown to Arizona and to Florida. Again, the guidance is where you live and sleep most of the time. And so the guidance that I am giving is if you are living in Minnesota most of the time, you may fill out your census form here in Minnesota. And there are a lot of people that makes sense to, that it resonates with. There's no specific guidance for snowbirds that the Census Bureau gives. They say where you live and sleep most of the time. So if you know a snowbird who lives and sleeps in Minnesota most of the time, I would encourage them to fill it out here. If you think about the resources that are used, the infrastructure, if they're using those for most of the time in this state, I think it seems reasonable and seems fair to me. Now, if that's not the case, if they're, split equally or they're in Arizona more or something, that's a different story. Yeah?
You talked about this window of time. What is that window? When does it begin? When does it end?
So the first mailings will go out in mid-March, And that first mailing for most of us will be an invitation to go online and to fill out the census form online. If that is followed a couple weeks later by another invitation, hey, did you get that first mailing? It would be a good idea to go online and fill it out. Again, if someone doesn't fill that out after a couple of reminders, eventually everyone gets the paper form. So if there's someone who doesn't do computers or someone who doesn't have good internet access, eventually they will get a paper form, and everyone will have the option to do it by paper. Census Day is April 1st, but you can fill it out beginning when that first invitation comes, or the form online opens up on March 12th. But it will ask you to reference April 1st. Where will you be living on April 1st? You will continue to get reminders through April, and if you still do not respond by the end of April, that's when census takers come out to knock on doors and encourage people to respond in person.
If you respond early on, are you gonna continue to get these reminders and paper forms later on?
Do you know what? I think, what we hear is there may be one additional reminder you get because it's kind of crossed in the mail, but what we hear is they're able to stop it. They're actually working with the Census Bureau closely enough so that the scan back is getting reported directly to the Bureau to stop all further. So you should not get additional ones, maybe one more if it's crossed in the processing, but you shouldn't get additional mailings. You also should not receive a visit from your friendly neighborhood census taker if you fill out the form. Yeah.
You live in a time when even our entire elections are being threatened by hacking, et cetera. What's being done and what are the concerns about the security of this information that people are putting in online?
So the Census Bureau and I don't have super in-depth knowledge because I know just what I learned from them as an outsider, but I know that they are working with kind of the folks in state government or in the federal government that are experts in cybersecurity. So they're working with the FBI, for example, in different departments to make sure that what they have is the best that they can have to protect the data. They're also working with the social media providers, so Twitter and Facebook, they have agreements where each of these companies have agreed to quickly report when they see stuff that is misinformation or disinformation campaigns. So they've got those kind of agreements worked out with Twitter, Facebook, and one other I'm not remembering right now. Maybe Google to get the information right back to them. A couple things I do want to point out that it is a real threat. Another kind of threat is just misinformation campaigns generally, and there are some kind of hotlines to call if you suspect that some of that is going on or that something doesn't look right. There's a 1-800 number to call so that it can be reported right away. I do want to remind folks that the information that you are submitting is pretty basic stuff. It's where you live, the number of people in your household, their ages, their sex, and their race, whether you own or rent the home. So this isn't social security number, this isn't bank account or anything like that. It still needs to be protected, but it's not as sensitive as a lot of the information that we're used to kind of shooting all over the planet with our, right now, when we buy things. Yeah?
Is there any way that there are tests against responses by folks to confirm that they're valid?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that's always been a part of the processing. Some of it is based on administrative records that they compare against. Some of it is just based on duplication of folks. So one of the questions that's asked is your name, your age. They do kind of search against, for example, if mom and dad at college or mom and dad at home just couldn't stand but keep that that college student off their form. I know moms who have like first-year college students who are like, oh no, I can't. I can't put them down over, I can't not put them on my form. If someone gets counted in both places, their process is in place to deduplicate those numbers. So that's part of what goes on after the responses are mailed back. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any way to get an idea how accurate our census is?
Yeah.
How would you do that?
There's a couple ways that it's done after the census. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. So the question was, how on earth would you, well, I'm paraphrasing. How would one figure out how accurate a census is after it's done? And there's two ways that they do it. They're kind of two independent ways, and they being the Census Bureau. They do something called a post-enumeration survey right after the census, where they go back and send people out to specific areas, sampled areas, to see how close they were to the count that they actually got. So really intensive counting by humans, boots on the ground, in a number of sampled areas across the US. So that's kind of based on a sample, how good did we do? And then there's another analysis that they do called demographic analysis, where they take the count they got and compare it to the number they should have based on births and deaths, and migration numbers. So a couple of those two ways, essentially they're sampling to see how accurate they are, or they're comparing it against administrative records. Yeah.
So, two questions. One, the ultimate end of the process, where no more paper, no more nothing, is what month?
They won't give us an absolute end date, but they say late summer.
Well, okay, this is gonna be a little bizarre, but could the political campaigns help distribute paper census information? Because there's people gonna be door to
Yeah.
door to the state, both parties.
I think they sure could. I know that some elected officials have taken it as part of their campaign to say this is important for our community to be counted. So, absolutely. I would say that the census engagement efforts and outreach efforts have found kind of a cousin in the get out the vote efforts, and so it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of like the sister or the cousin to get out the vote, get out the count. Yeah.
If I could just say, so I'm State Representative Jenny Cleaborn, and when I talk to people about the census, the easiest way to get people to understand how important it is I say this is such an easy way to bring our tax dollars back to our state. And then they're like, oh, really? And then you say it's about how we get counted so that we know how many of those tax dollars come back. And then people are pretty interested in it, and then you refer them to the website so they can learn more information. And I know our campaign this year will be talking about census and the importance of census during caucus and also at the convention to try to get more people engaged and involved. So talk to your neighbors. You are a more trusted source than a politician. So talk to your neighbors, tell them the importance of it, and encourage them to talk to 5 more people so that we spread the word that way.
Thank you.
To piggyback on that, there's I don't know what you call them, web communities, the next door, like it's me as next
Oh,
door.
yeah.
Thing. They're very active, so I'm thinking I'm gonna go home and just keep sending the message in April.
I love it.
If you could hit all of those,
I love it.
that would help. I think.
This is a process that we set up that if people kind of pledge to take the census using this texting tool, or if they go online, we also have it on our website, they will get a reminder with a link when it's time. And so if they're worried about missing it or knowing that they're kind of in the loop, this is one way to ensure. So that would be something I could imagine you could share on Nextdoor is saying it's coming, especially when the mailings start going out in mid-March or early April. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what efforts are being made to reach out to the immigrant or non-English speaking communities? And does immigration status figure in this at all?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Every single human, living, breathing person is counted regardless of citizenship status, regardless of immigration status. every human being who lives here is counted in the census or should be counted in the census. And of course, right now, there's a lot of fear for immigrants, and so it's going to be particularly difficult to encourage folks who are afraid for their own safety and for the safety of their family members to hand information over to the federal government, I think. So again, the efforts that we are supporting at the state and that many communities and local efforts and nonprofits and the foundation community have all kind of, organized around are to find those trusted voices, find the organizations that already have the trust of new immigrants, and work through them. They already know these folks. They already know that they wouldn't tell them something that wasn't true and know that it's something that benefits their communities. There's been a lot of research around kind of what messages resonate for new Americans, and for many, the message that this is how we built good schools, this is for kind of your children's future and for kind of how we fund the communities of which you are a part and which you want for your children. This is part of that effort. And even though the fears are very much real and they are going to be there in a couple months, I'm sure, that's a message that seems to resonate and for some folks to kind of balance the fear. So again, there's a lot of really great folks who work with new Americans, who work with refugee populations, who work with, particularly in the nonprofit communities, who have signed on to do this work. Yeah.
So, based on the large population increase in Minneapolis and St. Paul from 2010 to 18, there's almost 60,000 plus new residents who have not been counted in the census. So assuming they're mostly immigrants, can you do a drill down to describe a little bit more what that?
Who they are?
Yeah.
So part of it's births, part of it is just the number of people who have been born to people already living in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But part of it is people who have moved in from elsewhere. It's a little bit hard to drill down until you have another census to compare it against. That's kind of one of our tricks, is we age people forward 10 years and then we see who should be there, who isn't there, or who's there, who shouldn't be there based on that aging. That's kind of one of the tricks we have for figuring out just who moved in or moved out. But what I can say when I've looked at Minneapolis is that it's really been concentrated it's been concentrated kind of in the warehouse district downtown where all the growth has happened. We know kind of where the building permits have been. But it's also concentrated among people in their early 20s. So you've got a really small section, or small demographic group in terms of years that it's concentrated in. In St. Paul, that's much less the case, that you see much more of that growth being attributable to international immigration. Although I'll say that's true of Minneapolis as well, that both things are true. There's just a lot of movement in and out of the cities, and it would be very easy for me. I would love it if that were my job, that they all moved in like en masse. But really, they're coming in, they're coming out. But a lot of what I see in Minneapolis is white, non-Hispanic people in their 20s through late 20s that have moved into downtown Minneapolis. That accounts for a lot of the growth, but not all of it. Yeah.
What's being done to count homeless people?
So there is a specific kind of, everything the Bureau does, they call an operation. So there's an operation for people who are living in shelters. They are counted where they are on the night of the census. If it's a temporary housing facility, they're counted there. Shelter, there's a special enumeration on April 1st, just in homeless shelters. And right now, the Census Bureau is collecting that information from our office and from other nonprofits like the Wilder Foundation, who does the homeless survey and knows kind of where, what the whole universe of shelters are. For people who are on the street, on April 1st, there is an effort to go count people where they are living on census night. And so that looks very much like the homeless survey that Wilder does as well, the Bureau is now looking for spots that are places where people are likely to be living if they're out on the street. And so it's kind of a planning effort up into that night. And we're really relying in that, for that effort on service providers to let homeless folks know that it's coming. So it's not as scary as it likely would be if they just surprised them. Yeah. Yeah.
Go back to the demographics. Do you, can you speculate why we had an upturn in growth in the state in, was it 16 and 17?
Why did it look so good? So a couple of things. Births have been almost constant over that time period. They dipped down a little bit in 19. But I think what we saw in 17 and 18 was a positive net domestic migration, which just means we estimate that we had more people moving here than moving away. Why? I don't know why. I do know, I do have some idea. We've had very low unemployment for a very long time. I told you what the job shortage looks like. Word has gotten out that it is, there are opportunities here. And so what I believed to be happening was that we were pulling folks in, particularly from areas like Illinois, where they're seeing losses of 190,000. However, my story doesn't hold up in 2019, where we still have a very strong economy and aren't seeing that growth, at least in these numbers. I'm going to have to wait and see when the real census numbers come out. And again, this kind of illustrates we've got these estimates in between, but they're not the full count. They're not the final answer. This is as best we can do in the meantime to kind of make sense of what's gone on since the last one. Yeah.
Are you aware of any groups that are specifically acting against the census? I mean, we hear a lot of negativity and sort of fear mongering, but are there groups that are identifiable, that are trackable, that are trying to counter this because of the immigration issue?
Thank you. I forget every time. Please tell me every time. The question was, am I aware of groups that are working to counter kind of efforts around the census or to depress the census count? I'm not aware of any locally. I would anticipate that it's coming, not necessarily locally, but I anticipate that that disinformation campaigns are coming, because that's just the days that we live in right now. But I haven't seen that. I've seen that once people hear what it is and why we're doing it, they're for the most part, very open. If people are resistant personally to answering, they don't tend to go out and proselytize that position. They just, say, oh, it's very nice, but I'm not going to fill it out anyway. So I haven't seen it yet. I expect we will see it at some point. We could talk about the citizenship question, which was almost added, and that is a little bit different at the federal level. It turned out that the addition or the proposal to add that question was a little bit more motivated than just kind of what appeared to be at the surface, and so that's kind of one embodiment of potentially that kind of behavior.
So
Yeah.
follow-up question, who would benefit from a lower count for the state?
The question is, who would benefit from a lower count from the state of Minnesota? I don't think Minnesotans would. I just don't. One of the things about the citizenship question that eventually came out was that it looked to be a targeted effort to depress some kind of counts, to have a political outcome, a partisan political outcome, which I don't think makes sense, because if you look across the U.S. and look at where immigrants are, where non-citizens are, new Americans are. It's not straight red or blue. It's across the board where we see immigrants. So I don't really know the answer to the question. But
schools would certainly hurt, wouldn't they? I mean, they were, immigrant,
yeah,
I was down in Austin, and I was really impressed with the local school district down there and the efforts that they were making to have a complete count.
Great.
To reach all the different, speaking, non-English
Yeah.
speaking families. They have a huge investment to this thing.
yeah, yeah. We're seeing that. It's really, it's been so fun. So the comment was in Austin, the school district's working really hard to make sure that they are reaching their new Americans, new families. That's what I've been seeing too. I was out in Wilmer yesterday and heard from the Wilmer CCC. I heard from the Marshall CCC and from there was one more, Moorhead. And they're all really targeting the groups that they know are likely to be missed by the census, and they're doing it in pretty kind of fun and creative ways too. So it doesn't have to be a boring government form. Yes.
Could you go back to that slide where you had the 3 reasons to do the census, and the third one was smart decision making?
Oh, yeah. I skipped right over that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So when I'm not talking about the census, my other job is to help people get the data that they need at the state level and at the local level too, to get the data they need to make good decisions. And so when any policymaker is considering a policy change, they most often want to go to the data to make sure that they understand that the policies that they're making are actually reaching the intended audience and that they understand the community need. This is one of the only ways that we have of understanding truly what the community need is at a very granular level. And so I would say in terms of our public policy, we rely on these data all the time to make sure that we understand and can direct resources where they need to go, whether it's a policy decision or actually distributing funds for a particular program. And then businesses use these data to understand their markets, to decide where they're going to put their next store. I work very closely with Joan Neymark, who worked at Target for many years, and she is a census nerd. She is a census champion because she knows that Target, for example, relies so much on these data to place the next store, to understand what goes in the store, and to understand kind of what the pool of people who live around this store is and the pool of potential workers is. So it has all kinds of uses across both public and private spheres in Minnesota. Are you fired up? Are you ready to go? Let's do it. One more question. Yeah.
The initial question comes by mail, to an individual, to the house, and is filled out by one person or by each individual?
The initial mailing goes right to the residence. So wherever, to the house. It goes to the apartment or the house, wherever the person is living. That's where the mailing, the initial notice goes. It can be filled out by anyone over 18 in the household. And it's one form that asks the questions repeats the questions each time for every household member. So one form per household, one form per residence, and then the questions are repeated for each person who lives in the household.
Does that mean it's addressed to occupant of the address?
It is, or resident maybe, yeah, yep. Yep, yeah.
What about the proportion of the long form and the short form, is that still?
Yeah, so now it's only the short form because the long form has been rolled into an ongoing survey called the American Community Survey. So now it's just 9 questions that are repeated for each person in the household. So if there's one person that lives there, it's 9 questions and they're done. Yeah.
I was just looking at the form online, I think it's the form, and it had a place for social security number. No, it doesn't?
No.
Okay. I almost stopped.
That's disinformation.
No social, yeah, if you see someone asking for social, no social. Yep, so it'll be name, it'll be phone number. Phone number is collected just because they want information to be able to follow up, but no social, no bank account number, yeah. I think we're at time. Thank you, everyone, it's been fun. I hope you learned something.
Thank you, Dr. Brower, for an outstanding presentation. No, I don't think anybody could stump you tonight, so.
Someone asked me what happened to that 2019 number, I don't know yet.
Please stay for refreshments. If you see somebody with a tag, they should know something. Talk to them and ask them about clean elections. Thank you all very much for coming.